Hello everyone, my name is Yusuf and I'm a medical student. Today we'll be studying IMAT Logical Reasoning 101 and its first chapter is critical thinking. So there are going to be 5 IMAT questions from logical reasoning part, and it is one of the most understood subject because most students think that they can just memorize it and cram through this subject, but it's not like biology and chemistry, but actually it's really different because you have to use pure reasoning in logical reasoning. So it's like everything is given in this name. So how to apply those skills and strategies we will be studying in this specific course, so keep watching until the end. So the things that we will be studying, the first is going to be arguments, premises, conclusions, assumptions, fallacies, and how to strengthen and weaken an argument. So the first thing that we'll be learning is what is an argument, because without learning what is an argument you won't be able to understand the whole critical thinking part. So an argument contains actually two things. The first is it's the premise, and the other part includes the conclusion. So argument is something that is really different that we use in our common language, because we think that argument is a statement that we use as a disagreement in our everyday life. But in logical reasoning, argument is something really different. Argument means that it has a specific meaning, that it is trying to convey some knowledge or specific data to you. So it contains two parts, premise and the conclusion. Conclusion is a statement that the argument is trying to prove, and premise is the data, facts, or knowledge that supports the conclusion. So these two things are present in an argument, and that's how an argument is formed. An argument always contains at least one premise and one conclusion. There can only be one conclusion, but there can be one, two, or three, or many premises. But at least one premise and one conclusion is a definite thing. For example, let's take an example. The first example about is the simple example that you can see on the screen, that all medical students study hard. Sarah is a medical student, therefore Sarah studies hard. So there has been two premises that have been made in this statement. The first premise is all medical students study hard. The second premise is Sarah is a medical student, and therefore you have to keep in mind the word therefore. If has been a specific word like therefore, then there is a really high chance that the next statement is going to be a conclusion. So let's study some conclusion indicator words that tells us and can give us some hints that this is going to be a conclusion. So the conclusion indicators are therefore, thus, hence, so. It proves that, consecutively, this show that, this means that, we can conclude that, as a result, which proves that, demonstrating that. After these statements there is going to be a conclusion, and if there are specific words like because, since, as, for, given that, due to the fact, the reason is, on the grounds that, in view of, after these kind of words you can say that it is the premise and conclusion. So you can find a premise and conclusion using these indicator words. There is a thing that you have to keep in mind, that not all passages are arguments, because there are some passages that are not making any kind of claim and students think that they are actual argument. So you have to keep in mind something like a description, a question, or an instruction can never be an argument. You can see the examples on the screen. Okay, let's move on to knowing how to identify a conclusion and how to identify a premise. So to identify a conclusion, first you have to read the whole passage from A to Z, not leaving a single word. Because if you don't read the passage carefully, then you are going to miss a lot of things there. So first thing you have to do is that ask yourself the question that what is the author try to convey to us. Like if you have read the paragraph, what is the paragraph trying to tell you? What could be the conclusion? First of all, think of the whole summary in your mind and then move on to the third thing and ask yourself the question, if you are seeing so many statements and if the conclusion that you thought of and the statements that are given in the paragraph verify that specific conclusion, then that is actually the conclusion. If there is a statement that is not supporting the conclusion, then that might not be the conclusion. So the first and really most important thing that you have to think about is the therefore test. What is a therefore test? If you think that this specific line or this specific statement can be a conclusion, just use the word therefore in front of it. For example, if there is a statement that is saying that there are so many students that are failing IMAT, so if you use the word therefore in front of the sentence, like as the exams are getting really hard in IMAT, therefore so many students are failing IMAT. So the premise is that the exam is getting harder, and the conclusion is that students are failing the IMAT exams. I hope you get clear IMAT this year, but this was just an example. So that's how you can identify a conclusion. So next thing is that how you can identify a premise. As I told before, that premise is a statement that always supports the conclusion. So how can a statement can support the conclusion? So there are five ways that are like the most basics one. The first is about factual knowledge. Like they have stated a fact about 20% of people that do running are going to live longer than people who don't. That is like a factual knowledge. That's actually not real. I just made it up. So next thing is stat. For example, they say that four people died in an accident. So that is a stat. So that is a statistical premise that is supporting a conclusion. The next could be an analogy. Analogy is like a comparison between two things to support a specific conclusion. For example, they say that what should be the example? Like maybe yes, about seat belts. As seat belts save lives, wearing helmets can save your head injury. So they had two different statements and they used analogy to compare them, and that's how an analogical premise is made. They made the analogy between seat belt and helmet, how they both save lives. The next is causal premise. Causal premise is like if you say um, something cause something. If you do smoking, then you will have lung cancer. That is a causal premise. And then last thing is expert authority, like World Health Organization. If WHO says something, that it's going to be like 99.99% accurate, because they are experts in that field. If they say that there are 90% deaths due to COVID-19, then we have to believe that. Not necessarily, but they are the experts, so we have to believe it. So that's how you can identify premise and conclusions. So let's do some exercise questions to identify conclusions. So the passage is saying that antibiotic resistance is increasing globally. Overprescription of antibiotics is a major cause of resistance. Doctors are frequently prescribing antibiotics for viral infection, against which antibiotics are useless. Therefore, stricter prescribing guidelines are urgently needed. So they have given us the conclusion on their own. We don't have to find it. You can see the word therefore. Stricter prescribing guidelines are urgently needed. The conclusion is clear, but we will still prove it. As you can see, there have been like many premises. The first premise is like antibiotic resistance is increasing globally. So that's why they are stricting prescribing guidelines. So the premise is supporting the conclusion. The next premise could be like over prescription of antibiotics is a major cause of resistance. That is also a premise that caused the conclusion. The third premise is that doctors are frequently prescribing antibiotics for viral infections, against which antibiotics are useless. So all the three premises are telling us that the antibiotic is causing the people to get resistant to an infection, and that's why doctors are trying to prescribe guidelines that are urgently needed. So the conclusion has been proved by the premises that have been given to us. So that's how you find a conclusion. So there are other things that you have to know, that there are relevant premises and there are irrelevant premises. What is relevant and irrelevant? There might be some data given to you in the whole passage, but it might not be relevant to the conclusion. So that is an irrelevant premise. And if it is relevant, then it is called a relevant premise. For example, for the relevance test, ask each statement a question like, does this statement give us a reason to believe about the conclusion? If the answer is yes, then it is a relevant premise, and if the answer is no, then it is an irrelevant premise. For example, the NHS was founded in 1948. Today waiting times in AE are increasing, therefore the government must increase NHS funding. So we have two state premises. The first is like founding in 1948. Like background cannot be a premise. We don't know like 1948 what happened in 1948 is not sporting our conclusion. So that can't be a premise. The next thing is waiting times are increasing in A and E. So therefore the government must increase NHS funding. The next statement is saying that waiting times in A and E are increasing, therefore the government must increase NHS funding. So this can be a statement, and this is actually a premise, because this is the reason why government has increased NHS funding, because the waiting times are increasing. So that is a premise. So now you know how to find premises and how to find a conclusion. So that's how you can find a full argument and you can actually solve the passage.